So here's an interesting story. A hit and run that happened 56 years ago is back under investigation. Police near Kwamhlanga in Mpumalanga are searching for the driver of a car that caused a crash that left 9 pupils dead and 18 others injured. Haunted survivors of the crash, who are now pensioners living with horrific injuries, have now opened a case. Legal expert Marius Du Toit joins me now to unpack it all with full credit to the reporting of News 24, initial reporting on that particular story. Mr. Du Toit, thank you so much for talking to me. 56 years ago, talk about a cold case. What do you make of it all?
Well, firstly, we have to say, Thulasizwe, if it was 56 years ago and 9 people died, there must have been an inquest held at the time. I mean, you're not going to have an accident where 9 people are killed and it's suddenly, kept under the carpet and nobody knows about it. So there should have been records at the time. There should have been investigation at the time. There should have been a formal inquest held into the death of the 9 individuals, and there should have been a finding by the local magistrate. And if that finding implicated a person or persons, then of course it should have been referred to the then, it's now called the Director of Public Prosecutions, then it was called the Attorney General's Office. Then the Attorney General would have investigated and they would have considered prosecuting. So to say that we must now investigate it sounds a bit strange to me on face value, Thulasizwe, because I think there ought to have been a thorough, well, maybe not a thorough, because otherwise people would have been prosecuted, but there should have been an investigation into the death of those 9 unfortunate pupils.
Yeah. Does anything, turn on the situation as it was back then around justice and the inequality of it all, given who the victims were, pupils who were coming, from my understanding, from a competition, a choir competition, and as they were getting off the bus, they were then hit by a bakkie, and the name of the person that, the police are interested in hearing from, it sounds to me that it's a white Afrikaner man. Given the context at the time, would that have mattered in terms of how thorough the inquest was and perhaps the decisions taken by the then Attorney General?
Well, Thulasizwe, it shouldn't. I mean, a life is a life. The fact that 9 lives were taken, it doesn't matter who those 9 lives were at the time. I mean, it should have been investigated by the police. But that being said, Thulasizwe, we have seen in the past there have been instances where crimes have been wiped under the carpet and where nothing was done, or where a phony decision was made at the time. We've seen that. I mean, it did happen in the past and we can't deny it. Whether we can jump to that in this instance is perhaps at this early stage a stretch. I think what one must do is first find the original inquest records and determine what actually was the cause of what actually resulted in the findings by the magistrates court, and whether in fact prosecution ought to have been instituted or not. I can only imagine, on the facts that we have at this stage, it's clear that culpable homicide was committed. It's clear that a prosecution ought to have been instituted. And there's no reason why it wasn't done. The only difficulty one has is it's 56 years later. And the statute of limitations, if one looks at the Criminal Procedure Act, places a difficulty for the state in the sense that certain offences prescribe after 20 years. And culpable homicide is one of those offences. So if the state had not instituted prosecution against an individual 56 years later, they can't do so now. That would be too late.
Wow. If,
however, just from a practical point of view, let's assume, Thulasizwe, they had a warrant of arrest for this person. They couldn't find him because he was in hiding. And as a result, this warrant has gone stale because nobody found this person. And now, after 56 years, they're suddenly able to arrest him. Well, that's a different story. Now we have to say to ourselves, well, he was the cause of the fact that there was no prosecution instituted because he was in hiding. But if no prosecution was ever instituted, I think the horse might have bolted on this thing. Wow. I think it might be too late, other than perhaps seeking at least some consolation and getting some clarity for the victims who might still be alive at this stage. the next of kin and the family members who had to go through this trauma, giving them some clarity on what exactly happened. But it might be too late to institute a prosecution now, 56 years later.
So if there's that statute of limitation on the charge of culpable homicide, what about civil avenue? Is there anything that can be explored in that direction?
No. Similarly, civil cases prescribe after 3 years from the time that you have acquired knowledge of the identity, or you ought to have acquired knowledge of the identity of the wrongdoer or the person that owes you money. So the moment the identity of this person was known, the moment we know who he is, and let's say this was known 56 years ago, then 3 years within 3 years, action had to be instituted for emotional shock or whatever the trauma might have been at the time. 56 years later, it will be very difficult to try and prove civil liability at this stage, especially where the cops have known the identity of the person all along.
Sure. Lastly then, Mr. Du Toit, just our sense and conviction of what justice is about, right? There were nine pupils that passed on and 18 others were injured. So an injury and harm actually happened. Objectively speaking, it did happen. What does a case like this say to us about our sense of wanting to see justice done, no matter how long it takes? Does justice needs to be vindicated at all costs, given the technicalities that you and I have spoken about, the statutes of limitation, as well as the prescription on issues of civil claims. But does a sense of justice, one way or another, need to be achieved here?
Well, I tell you what, Thulasizwe, I think the most important thing for victims is that they must never let something like this just gather dust for 56 years. If you've been wronged by any person, we are all equal before the law, which means that if I've done you wrong, I should pay the price for it, whether it's civilly or criminally, but there should be retribution, there should be consequences for what I've done. There should be damages. So the last thing you want to do is to just let something slip for 56 years and then only deal with it when you have pension. I think that's the sad thing about the story. You know, if we ignore the legal principles for a moment, I mean, behind all of this, we have individuals who've suffered severe trauma. And after 56 years, the trauma is still with them. And the sad thing is they never experienced justice in this matter. They never did. It's just sad that they've waited so long to only go and pursue it now. You know, it does happen from time to time, Thulasizwe, where people come to you and say, listen, can you please assist me in a matter that happened so many years ago? And, you know, as an attorney, you try and uplift the file, you try and get behind the truth of it, because ultimately, if somebody wronged you, you should be prosecuted. And when 9 people have been killed and multiples have been injured, that is a very big accident. And that's an accident where, number one, if convicted, you'll go to jail for it. You won't get a suspended sentence. You'll go to jail for that sort of offense.
Yeah.
So ultimately, justice in a matter like this ought to have been that a person went to jail, the person ought to have been sued. And the only question that really remains is what truly happened in the 56 years? Why wasn't it done? And perhaps the wise thing will be to try and find files. I don't know if one's going to be able to find files this old, and try and get behind the truth of it all, because ultimately that's what we want. We want truth to be revealed.
Yeah.
And if there was a cover-up, well then, you know, one has to investigate it. But it's just so difficult to try and elicit the truth or to get behind the truth when the matter is so old. You might not be able to find anything about it.
All right. Marius Du Toit, thank you so much for your insights there, just weighing in on this intriguing case initially reported on News 24 of a Mpumalanga man who basically has laid a charge of culpable homicide some 56 years after a crash killed 9 pupils and injured 18 others. He was among those who were injured. Our understanding is that they were coming from a choir competition, and they were celebrating having won. And just as they were alighting from the bus, they were hit and run over by a bakkie. And police are now investigating 56 years later. And as you heard there from Mr. Du Toit, there may be difficulties technically in terms of prosecution of this charge of culpable homicide.